Don't know what I just did. Let's not do that. Okay, cool. I think we're good to go. And I think our last few folks are joining us too. Perfect. Hi, Aiden. Hi, Leela. Not speak today. All right, perfect. Well, welcome. It's great to see all of your faces. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I hope you don't see my desktop because it is getting to a very bad place. Don't judge. As my life gets crazier and crazier, the desktop fills, and then eventually I just pull everything into a folder. So right now we're in the crazy time. There we go. But now you just see my screen and it looks nice. So welcome to week 3. We are going to jump right in. We're doing a lot today, and I want to make sure we give you plenty of time to get into groups and present your linguistic landscapes. And I'm going to start us off with a couple announcements. And then I'll open it up for any of you who have questions or things you want to talk about before we get started. So this week, we're focusing on planning for translanguaging and instruction and assessment. So you've had the first 2 weeks kind of as framing, some examples of what it looks like in practice, but now we're really moving into kind of, okay, how do we create a translanguaging classroom? What does it look like in practice? I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but I'm actually coming to you from Amsterdam. I have a conference next week in Spain, and decided to come out a little bit earlier and join my partner who was doing some research in Amsterdam. So it is nighttime where I am. I don't know if you can see that the windows are very dark. It's 10:30. So I've got some coffee with me to keep me going, but just wanted to let you know that. And since I've been here for the last couple of days, I have had linguistic landscapes on the mind and just wanted to share with you some of the things I've been observing, because I promise you too, once you do a linguistic landscape, you just start to see language everywhere. And it's been really interesting being in the Netherlands and seeing how much English is used, and the ways in which English and Dutch and other languages are just intertwined in so many ways. So you see a few signs that I took pictures of, some advertisements that show. The one on the left, I looked up what it means because I don't speak Dutch. It means like a big family. And you can see the word stream. A lot of technology words I've noticed have like been introduced in English and then just kind of stayed in English in many languages. So the word stream exists in Dutch, but they use stream now, stream and you new. And then here, unlimited only. So you see translanguaging everywhere. And then on this was a whole massive wall of posters advertising different things at a cafe, and lots of examples of Dutch and English kind of intertwined throughout. So yeah, language is all around us and translanguaging is all around us, not only in Europe, but I think you see it quite visibly in Europe with English and other languages, but certainly all over the US as well. So I'm very excited to see what you learned from your schoolscapes, and those of you who got into your different communities, what you learned from those landscapes. Okay, so that's one announcement. The other is I just sent an email out about this, so you probably got that in your inbox. But there's another elective option this summer. So if you still have room for one more elective, I did want to make you aware of this one, especially if you're a person who likes having in-person learning experiences. There's a Summer Institute in Digital Literacy happening this summer, the 12th version of it. And this year, for the first time, not only is the focus on digital literacy and on storytelling, but also there's a strand focused on multilingualism and multilingual learners, and on translanguaging. So I will be helping facilitate some sessions. My colleague, Dr. King, will be facilitating some sessions. A bilingual teacher who went through our program, who works at Spaziano, is going to be facilitating some sessions. So if you're looking for one more elective, I highly recommend this. It sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun because it's not just workshops and learning. It's also a lot of like hands-on opportunities to build some digital tools for your students. And so there's 4 virtual sessions and then 3 full-day workshops. And if you do all of that, you can do it for credit. You can get a 3-course credit for engaging in the full institute. So if you have questions, you can email me, you can email Kara, but they said they have there's space for about 3 to 5 more people. So they're seeing if anyone else wants to join us. So yeah, those were my 2 announcements. Does anybody have any questions or announcements before we jump into our agenda? Okay, we'll jump in. Okay, so we're going to start off with a little bit of review from some of the content of last week. I really enjoyed reading your discussion posts and wanted to touch on a few threads and themes that came up in your discussion, especially kind of how we're thinking about language and academic language in particular, and then this idea of a translanguaging stance really being tied to social justice. From there, we'll move into linguistic landscape presentations, and I'm anticipating giving you about a half an hour to meet in small groups, and you'll be presenting. I'm going to join one group, so I'll be able to see some of your presentations live, but for everybody else, that's why I have you do the videos, so I can watch your presentations. And then if we have time after that, we'll have a little bit of conversation about advocacy since it came up in a few of your discussion posts. And then we'll transition to talk about what you're engaging with this week, and in particular, 2 of the assignments that you're going to start working on this week. So that is our plan. Like I said, if you do have questions or want me to pause at any moment, do know you can always unmute, or I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. So let me know at any time if you want to stop and jump in and ask something. Okay, all good to keep going? Okay, I see Patricia's thumb up. Perfect. Let's do it. Okay, so first I wanted to say the discussion boards have been great. I've really enjoyed how much you're engaging with the range of readings and viewings. So most of you are not just talking about one reading, but you're doing a nice job of talking about all of the content from the week, which I really appreciate. And your responses to classmates have been so nice to see, the ways that you're moving the conversations forward, the way that you're quoting readings and also often quoting your classmates when you respond to their posts, and you're affirming them, asking questions, making connections. So I just wanted to lift up the good work you're doing as you're making sense of the content together. For the language portraits and I am from poems, all of those are graded, and so you should be able to see your grades and feedback on Brightspace. And I put a few here that I thought were particularly great, although they were all really, really lovely to see. It was really interesting to see the connections you were making between language and place, language and people. And it was interesting to see that extended not only to your own family members, but some of you included languages that are the languages your students speak, languages your friends speak that you've learned through engaging with your friends, through your own family histories, connecting to your ethnicity and your race, to food. And so that was really, really cool to see from your poems and your language portraits. And I also really appreciated the thoughtful reflection of what was being included in your language portraits. Some of you, like Erin, kind of reflected upon, what languages get to be included, and how you noted that you did end up adding Spanish, even though initially you were like, well, I'm not fully fluent. And for a lot of you, kind of pushing on that idea of like, well, is it still part of my repertoire? Yeah, right. So like kind of what does it mean to have a language be a part of your identity? Which I appreciated. People adding different registers and affinity groups. I appreciated, Dorothy, that you added in American Sign Language, you added in augmentative and alternative communication. Some of you added in kind of teacher language, teacher talk. And so bringing in those different ways of languaging I thought was really powerful, and non-vocal languages as well with that example. And connecting to your different family languages. Sky, appreciated how you did that with yours, and the connections you made between kind of being rooted in certain languages with the belts and the shoes that you added. So all in all, really exciting to see the way you were engaging with those. And yeah, just wanted to thank you for that. Okay, so I guess that was actually technically week 1, so moving into week 2. So a few themes I wanted to briefly touch on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk through a couple different ideas, and then I'm going to put you in groups to make sense of some of this together. So we're going to talk a little bit about language, and then we'll talk about translanguaging and as a social justice stance. So I wanted to start, and I'll have you also unmute if you don't mind, with a couple questions. So take a look at these words, and I want you to tell me what language you see. So we have the words taco, sushi, and croissant.
Can I go?
Sure, go ahead.
Right away, I see Spanish,
Okay.
Japanese, and French.
Okay. Spanish, Japanese, French. Does everybody agree with that?
In English too.
Yeah. What do you mean English too?
Like those words we took from other languages and now they're part of our English language.
Okay, all right. So these are words you can identify readily with another language, but you also know we use them in English. Okay. What about these words? Buffet, genre, karaoke, kindergarten, guru, and ballet.
Ballet, buffet, or French. Kindergarten, I know. Oh, I think it's German, or it comes from there.
Yeah. Anyone else?
And then with these, we also, similar to the first ones, English, because these are all words that we use as English words, but maybe have borrowed from other languages.
Yeah. Yeah. So this list is maybe less readily identifiable as non-English words, right? Because these are words that we do commonly use and we don't immediately, like taco, think about it maybe think of it with Spanish, right? So buffet, you might not immediately be like, oh, that's a French word, but we use it commonly and it comes from French, right? Genre also from French, karaoke from Japanese, kindergarten from German, guru from Hindi, and ballet from French. So we have these words in English, right, that come to us from other languages. And I think it's a great example of the fact that languages are not as neatly bounded as we sometimes think they are, right? English and all languages are full of the influence of other languages. Now I want you to look at these words and tell me what language they are. Parquear and troca.
I see a lot of people using parquear in a way that they're trying to, because it sounds like a Portuguese trying to say that they're going to park somewhere, park the car somewhere.
Mhm.
And so because our verbs ends in ER, so they use park, like to park, and they kind of use that conjugation for it. And troca is
Troca is in Portuguese too.
it's like an exchange. We
Yeah,
exchange
the
something. Like,
switch.
yeah, I don't know in Spanish if it's the same thing, but troca, like it's a transaction kind of type. But here it doesn't look like as a verb. So it
Mhm.
could be something else.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so that I love that you're bringing these lenses from Portuguese to these as well. So these are words that are commonly used by people who speak English and Spanish. So I'm wondering, so those are great insights. Before I do any reveal, I'm curious, anyone who speaks Spanish, can you add any more insights into these words?
Yeah, these are two words that are a big part of my vocabulary, even though my parents like to remind me they're not technically correct, you know. Parquear, kind of like Patricia was saying, to park. And then troca would be like the mixing of truck in English and camioneta in Spanish, but we say troca.
Yeah, exactly. Also interesting to know that it registers as another word in Portuguese too. Exactly. Yeah. So these are interesting pieces of language, right? Because they are examples of language influence, right? So just like buffet and genre came into English from French, and now we recognize those words as English words and also perhaps as French words. Parquear and troca are examples of Spanish and English coming together and language being reinvented in new ways, right? And we do this with language all the time, right? Languages come together and we gain new words, we create new words, and even within language, we create new words. One of my favorite things to do every year is to see what new words have been added to the dictionary. Does anybody else do that for fun? No? Well, if you don't, you should, because it's always so entertaining to see what new words we've invented. Here's a few that were added in 2024. Greedflation, to name what was happening as prices were going up because of the pandemic, and companies decided to make a little extra money since we expected high prices anyway. So they made record profits as we were all paying more money, greedflation. Mid, which is a word that I honestly didn't know what it meant, so I had to look it up, and apparently it means like meh. Many of you probably know that already. And girl dinner, which is something that I do eat quite often, which just means like a small kind of dinner of little things that you're like you're making a dinner out of kind of snacky items. So we invent words all the time. We get words from other languages. We create new words when languages come together. These types of words that are added regularly to sites like dictionary.com and eventually to printed dictionaries as well, we often lift up and we celebrate how our language is living and evolving. We don't always do the same with words that are being created across languages, right? So Spanglish, as you read about for this week, is legitimate language. It is what happens as people who use language are creative with language, right? As we create words to describe our reality, words like parquear and troca come into being. However, as you also learned about for this week, language is deeply connected to relations of power. So while Spanglish is something that is recognized as a legitimate way of languaging, the Royal Academy of Spanish, which is the governing body of the Spanish language, we don't have a parallel in English, but in Spanish there is a group of people who come together to determine what goes into the Spanish dictionary, what is correct Spanish. They define Spanglish as a form of speech used by some Hispanic groups in the United States in which they mix deformed elements of vocabulary and grammar from both Spanish and English. Then you can just like it's like dripping with deficit framing, right? The deformed elements of grammar and vocabulary, which of course is not how a linguist would understand words like troca and parquear, and not how I hope anyone in here would understand what happens when we use language in the way that language naturally evolves and becomes combined over time. So I want you to kind of keep those things in mind as we think about then what we mean when we talk about academic language. So if we recognize that language is living, it continues to evolve, that people are creative with language, but language is also tied to relations of power, those are important lenses to bring as we think about the language that we use at school and that we expect students to use at school. And in the article that you read on Abyssal Thinking, the central critique that Garcia and her colleagues were raising against academic language is not against academic language itself, perhaps, but really the idea of it being held up above other forms of languaging, and then kind of as a contrast to the ways that racialized bilingual children are languaging. You'll notice in the book that this critique is not as strong. It's a bit of a gentler critique of academic language, because they talk about it in the book more as students' languages providing them with access to these codes of power, because they show throughout the book how translanguaging can be a vehicle for learning academic language. So the central idea, I think, for us then is how do we think about this idea of providing access to language that students use at school, while also validating and lifting up the other ways of languaging, especially those ways that have been the most marginalized and the people who have been the most marginalized. And I thought, a lot of you reflected on this in really powerful ways in the discussion board. I know, Patricia, you talked about Portuguese and Creoles and thinking about those within a dual language learning context, and how Portuguese itself is like a colonizing language, even as within a US context, it may be a marginalized language. And so we end up with these kind of language hierarchies. And so how do we think about, giving students access to what are seen as academic ways of using language while also validating their ways of using language as legitimate, as tools for learning, and as legitimate ways of languaging, right? In the same way that we want to validate a student who's translanguaging or using Spanglish, what we might call Spanglish, right? To help us think about this, I want to propose another way to think about what academic language is, and another term for talking about academic language that I often use, which is the language of schooling. So kind of thinking of it as the language that we use at school to accomplish different purposes. And this term, the language of schooling, comes from Mary Schleppergrell's work, which is really rooted in a functional understanding of language. If you've had other classes with me, you've learned a little bit about this before, but essentially a functional lens on language asks, what are we using language to do? Like, what is the context? Who is the audience? So it's really about seeing, looking at the purpose of language use rather than naming language as a type of language. This is academic language. This is conversational language. It's saying, what are we actually using the language to do? So for example, you might say, we're using language to persuade, we're using language to inform, we're using language to narrate. And then you start to think about, okay, what language choices do I want to make if I'm trying to persuade my classmates to believe a certain thing in a written form? And that's one way of thinking about academic language, as opposed to it just being a thing. It's a thing that allows us to do accomplish different functions. Another way to think about it is through a disciplinary lens. What is the discourse community that we're engaging with? So WIDA breaks this into different areas, right? The language of science, the language of math, the language of social studies, the language of language arts. So those of you who teach science, for example, you know, you're apprenticing your students into using language the way that scientists use language, writing like scientists, reading like scientists, speaking like scientists. So that's another way to think about, you're not just teaching them academic language, you're teaching them how to engage the way that biologists engage. And so that, I think, in some ways helps to level that playing field a little bit between elevating academic language by just making it one type of way of engaging with language to accomplish a particular purpose or to engage with a particular discourse community. And importantly, again, you can see in this purple box, this way of languaging also recognizes that a lot of these skills to persuade, learning how to persuade, learning how to talk like a mathematician, those skills can be learned across languages, even if at times you're asking students to perform monolingually when the audience or the context requires it. So I might want my students to be able to write a science report in English, but maybe I can support them in developing the knowledge of how to do that, the content that goes into that report across languages. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we're envisioning what it means to support our students to be successful in the language of schooling. Okay, and one other thing I want to share with you that you have seen before, perhaps if you took EDC 516 with me. So in EDC 516, which is our methods course, you look at this book, Scaffolding Language, Scaffolding Learning by Pauline Gibbons. It's one of my favorite TESOL BDL books, so highly recommend it. If you haven't read it or if you're not in our program and you just want another resource. And Pauline Gibbons talks about this mode continuum for thinking about academic language, kind of moving from everyday registers, which are more context embedded, to context reduced language or more academic language as one way to think about kind of this spectrum that students are always moving across when they're in schools. So context embedded would mean whatever it is I'm talking about, I have with me. So if I'm teaching students about, see what I have within reach about watches and how watches work. I have a watch in front of me. We're looking at the watch and how to tell time using the object, right? And then context reduced would be writing about how to tell time without any visual in front of you, without the tangible manipulative. So we've reduced the context, right? Which is a more challenging way and often requires us to use more details, more complex forms as we communicate something that does not have the context immediately in front of us. And Pauline in the book gives this example of engaging in a science experiment using realia, using real life objects, is one example of kind of context embedded. So if students have this, you can see this experiment here with paper clips and magnets. Students might talk to each other saying, look, it's making them move. You see how the magnet's making the paper clip move? And then the goal might be to move them towards writing a research report about this scientific phenomenon. Something like magnetic attraction occurs only between ferrous metals. That's a big leap, right? But that's kind of what we're doing often when we're trying to move our students towards some of these school-based ways of using language. And she talks about this and says, one in-between step is teacher-guided reporting. So teachers kind of serving as that scaffold. So students share out what they're seeing and the teacher's giving them academic language as they're sharing. So look, it's making, when we did this, it pushed it away. Oh, it repelled the paperclip. Yeah, it was repelling the paperclip. So you're kind of feeding them some of that language and that structure to help serve as a scaffold. I would argue, excuse me, that translanguaging also can serve in that role. So when they're engaging with this experiment, students can be using other languages, right? Mira cómo se mueve. You can be talking with one another about what you're observing in any language. Excuse me. And then when students are engaging in the task of learning more kind of academic forms, bringing in connections to students' home languages. So ferrous, which is a word that I honestly had to look up because it's been a long time since I've learned about magnetic attraction, comes from the Latin word ferrum. It means iron, and that's why there's attraction, right? Because those metals contain iron. The Spanish word hierro also comes from the word ferrum, right? It has the same Latin root. So helping students see that this word, this very academic word in English, has a Latin root and actually connects to a word that students might be familiar with in Spanish, is a way to deepen their knowledge, build vocabulary, and affirm the knowledge that they already bring. So this is just one example of how we can think about kind of what academic language really is, how we can support students to get there, and the role that translanguaging could play within that process. And then I want to end with a couple last thoughts, which is I think it's important as we're thinking about academic language that we are continuing to validate all forms of languaging. And that is really the point that was being made throughout a lot of the things you engaged with last week. These are two examples from teachers that I've worked with. One teacher last year shared that in her classroom, they talk about spoken English versus written English as a way to validate how students talk and say, yeah, it makes sense that you would say wanna or kinda. It would sound weird if you always said, I've got to go, or I'm going to do this. It's, it's some of the ways that we write would be much too formal for speaking. But when we're writing, we separate some of these words out more formally, right? And on the right side, you see a bilingual teacher I worked with who in his classroom, it was a Spanish-English bilingual classroom, he actually had a space for documenting translanguaged words like some of the ones we just talked about, like troca. Here you see la carpeta as something in between la alfombra and the carpet, right? So he was documenting when students use these translanguaged words, validating them, right? Yeah, these are other ways of being bilingual. These are words you're using that are valid in this space, but drawing their attention to, but this is how you would say it in kind of more traditional Spanish, and this is how you say it in traditional English. But these other ways that you're using language are also ways of communicating, which I think can be really powerful. You see on the side, he also had a cognate wall. So always looking to make connections between English and Spanish, and those words that share a root and mean the same thing can be a great way to do that. Sorry, one more final thing, that academic language is not always more complex. One of you mentioned this in your discussion post, and I just wanted to bring up this point that often it's more complex, but many other ways of languaging beyond middle class white ways of using English are really complex. And I can't remember if I included this in one of my videos or not, but Black English, for example, African American Vernacular English, is really complex in terms of the grammar. And it expresses past tense, present tense, and future tense in more nuanced ways than English does. As you can see in this chart, there's a way of describing something that recently happened in the past, that was a little bit before that was just right before the present. So the ways that they use, that Ben is being used, the word to be is being used throughout, change kind of what we're talking about in terms of time. And so many different dialects have a lot of complexity, even if they're not always validated and recognized as such. Okay. And then finally moving into translanguaging as a social justice stance, which many of you reflected upon in great detail, and I think it was came across pretty strongly through your discussion posts. I wanted to share a few that I thought were particularly good in terms of translanguaging stance definitions. Layla mentioned to hold a translanguaging stance is to see students' multilingualism as a powerful asset to their learning rather than as something to manage or suppress. It's not just about allowing the use of home languages, it's about intentionally planning for their use, which I thought was really, really great. And then Megan mentioned, again, similarly, it's not just a teaching strategy, it's an ethical commitment to and valuing students' full linguistic repertoires, honoring their families and communities as vital sources of knowledge, and co-creating classroom spaces that push back against linguistic hierarchies and inequities. Taking a translanguaging stance means challenging classroom hierarchies, which requires bravery and knowledge to support this stance. And indeed it does. And a lot of you talked about that, how do we create these spaces? And we'll continue to think about advocacy, but it does require pushing back a little bit and saying, yeah, like, you know, we will make sure that they learn academic language. We understand that that matters. We'll make sure they learn English. We know that that matters, but we can create multilingual classroom ecologies that get us there. We can value and leverage their other ways of languaging in the classroom and talk about language and power in ways that empower them, rather than tell them that their ways of languaging are not permitted in the classroom, right? So I think these are both really powerful definitions of what the stance is. And then abyssal thinking was something you read about, so I just wanted to, it can be kind of, I know that article can be a little bit dense, but I hope you still found it meaningful. It seemed like a lot of you really enjoyed it. And so the idea, again, of abyssal thinking, which comes from a Portuguese scholar, De Sousa Santos, is that idea that we're kind of creating a line separating legitimate and illegitimate, what's seen as accessible and what is seen as non-existent at all, right? Like in the abyss. And so Garcia and her colleagues were making the argument that we're putting language and people who are languaging in ways that are not, as you know, mainstream white middle class ways of languaging in the abyss. And so if you're interested, this De Sousa Santos applies this more broadly into all of these binaries we create. This is a visual of some of the ways that he does this work in his own writing: self and other, in-group and out-group, global south, global north, but just kind of this way of like how we create these binaries of what is seen as permissible and legitimate and what is not even seen at all, kind of in the abyss. Okay, and we know, as Garcia and colleagues said, that that translanguaging then has to have a social justice stance. It has to be committed to engaging in this work. That it isn't just about saying, "Great, all languages are welcome here. We'll sing a good morning song in all the languages of the world, and we've done enough," right? But it's recognizing that we need to work to fight against some of these inequities. Otherwise, we're maintaining and contributing to these existing racial and linguistic and class inequities. Okay, so that was a lot, but just to kind of give you some additional things to think about and to support some of the learning that you were engaging with together. I'm going to break you into small groups now, and what I want you to do with all of this in mind and with the content from the readings in mind, I want you to envision that we are in a class together in person. And I want you to create a poster that we could put up on our wall if we were all together, that would have 3 principles about how we think about language in this class, as we've engaged together so far, that we could put up in our classroom. So we're going to structure it as in this classroom we believe. So 3 statements that you would like to collectively make about language. And you're welcome to add visuals. You're welcome to incorporate languages other than English for our virtual posters. So let me get out of here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is drop this in the chat. So what I did is I created just these empty slides. So whatever group you're in, go to that group number. The directions are still here. And again, I'll give you just a few minutes to generate your 3 principles. You can add visuals, other languages as you see fit, and then we'll come back together to share those. Sound good? Okay, cool. I'm going to stop sharing. There is the link. Let me know if you can't access it. And all right, so I'm going to put you into 5 rooms. No, we'll do 4 rooms. Okay, all right, the rooms are open. I'll see you in a few minutes. Hello, welcome back. Did you have enough time to make your poster? Awesome. All right. Perfect. Okay, welcome back, welcome back. I think folks are still trickling in. Awesome. And I realize I didn't ask you to assign a spokesperson, so you'll have to self-select in a moment when you see your groups appear. But good. Did you guys have some good discussion, kind of thinking about what was valuable from the readings and what we just shared? Cool. Okay, I think we're all back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep. Okay, great. Okay, we're gonna share out what we included. You're welcome to share anything else you'd like to add about your discussion. But let's start with group 1. And would one of you be willing to self-nominate as your spokesperson? What's on your poster for our classroom?
Yeah, I could talk about it. I guess I'll read the 3 first and then kind of talk about what we discussed. So in this classroom, we believe in the freedom of expression through language. In this classroom, we believe that diversity makes us stronger as a learning community. And in this classroom, we believe that every language tells a story. So I think the overarching idea was that everyone kind of brings a valuable piece of knowledge through their diversity or through their language to the overall learning community.
Awesome. I love this. And I love the image you included too, just thinking about kind of being across borders, languaging across borders. Awesome. Thanks, group 1. Group 2.
So we kind of, in this classroom, we believe everybody's words matter and are powerful. We kind of did this one to keep in mind like the idea of a language and power. So giving, recognizing that everyone's words are powerful. To be creative in how you express yourself, language flexibility is encouraged. Kind of that idea of translanguaging and having that flexibility of expressing yourself. And then we can all learn from each other and each person's unique skills, backgrounds, and identities that they bring to the table. So like more on like everyone's voice is important and deserves to be heard.
Awesome. I love it. And I love the theme kind of going throughout it of like empowering students with what they bring. Awesome. Thanks, group 3 or group 2, group 3.
I added a picture, but it's not there.
Oh no, here, I'll exit out and then I'll go back in.
Okay, thanks. There we go. Okay. I put these pictures because this is what they have in at ICS, or at least that's what they had, and it was in Portuguese or whatever. But I think it's really cool. The superpower like sign that they have. We wrote, we believe language is a way to communicate and is welcome to be used freely. Multilingualism is a superpower because it empowers student learning. And every language I speak tells a part of my story. Because we were saying like I just don't feel like if you like take away part of like someone's language or you tell them they can't use it, it's like taking a part of their identity away. Like the identity and language are so strongly connected that it's like telling the person they can't be who they are or like not letting them be who they are. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I definitely felt that as I was looking through your identity portrait, your language portraits, that like the ways in which you were connecting language to your identity and your history, and it is so deeply connected to our stories. So I think that's a really powerful belief statement. Yeah, thank you so much. Last but not least, group 4.
So we said for our first one that in this classroom, we believe every student's language and linguistic repertoire is valuable. And then we said that like students' home language can help leverage learning in the classroom. And that's why we put that picture with the like hook for the home language, and then anything else like they're learning is added onto that hook so that their home language is being used to help with that learning. And then again, like Erin just said, language is a part of our identity. So we put that little thumbprint and some language images to kind of show that for students, especially when they're learning, like that language is a part of who they are.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. I wish we could actually physically hang some posters like this on our walls, but this can be our virtual space. And I encourage you to think about what it might look like to do an activity like this with your own students, and to have it posted visibly on the wall, some of your beliefs about language and language use. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with teachers who've told me, I tell teachers or my students they can use whatever language they want, but they still use English. And sometimes it's like, well, yeah, English is so powerful. If you're in an English mainstream classroom, you often have to like be really intentional and explicit about what it means to create these spaces, and these types of conversations, these types of visuals, I think can be powerful. So thank you for those. We'll keep them virtually around us. But I think this is a good time to transition to talking about the language around us that you documented, and thinking about all of those statements you just made and then how they connect to the reality of the spaces that you were engaging with and the communities that are in those spaces. So we're going to quickly move into it because I want to make sure we have time to come back and talk a little bit about where you're headed for this week. So I'm going to put you in groups of 3. You'll have 25 minutes to share, so that's enough for everyone to get 7 minutes. And then if yours is slightly longer, okay, or you'll have a minute or 2 for questions as you transition. And I'll be joining one group, but like I said, I'm going to watch all of them. One thing I forgot to do is to ask you to upload your slides as well, because it's helpful for me to also be able to look at your slides in addition to your videos. So if you didn't include your slides on Brightspace after class, please upload those just so I have those as a reference point. But yeah, I'm excited to share and see what you learned. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to create some new groups. So let's create new breakout rooms with 3 people. Okay, recreate. So you should be with some new folks. I'll open the rooms, and again, I'm going to set a timer for 25 minutes to make sure I can bring us all back together. So time yourselves as well. Try to keep it to about 7 minutes so everybody has a chance to share, and you can go ahead and head to your groups.
So I guess they're still going because I know that she was a part of a group. So
Yeah, that's true.
Mhm.
Nope, I'm muted. Hi, everybody.
Uh,
Let me figure out how to end these breakout rooms. Okay, I'm sending everybody back. Did you have enough time to go through all of yours? Good. Any initial reflections or things that came up in your conversation?
Basically, everything's super English dominant. That was like the general gist.
It's the takeaway. Were all of yours school-based ones?
Yeah. But I was saying for mine, like we had things labeled around the school.
Okay, that's good. So like labeled in other languages?
Different languages, but they were associated with a flag. Yeah, but like they associated it with a flag, but the flags don't represent the backgrounds of the students.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's just
So
being multilingual, but not specific to the students that are in that.
right. Like the Spanish one has the Puerto Rican flag, but most of our kids are Ecuadorian and Guatemalan.
Hmm, interesting. Oh. Awesome. Well, I hope everyone had a good time engaging, and I'm sorry that we're kind of tight on time, so we're not going to have a lot of time now to kind of unpack it. But it does seem like a takeaway was lots and lots of English, and we had an interesting comparison in the group I was in between like the community being more multilingual and representative of the people in that space, and then the schools just not so much. So hopefully you were able to learn something or kind of see some parallels across across your nope, not share across your different presentations. And I'm looking forward to hearing all of them in your recordings. So with our last few minutes, I just want to give you kind of a preview of where you're headed this week. All of the information you need is online anyway, so it'll just be a kind of a quick overview. But this week, now we're transitioning from thinking about language and identity and language and power to really thinking about what does it mean to do this work in the classroom. You'll be engaging with different readings and viewings. And then your main assignments that I wanted to just briefly touch on now are, in addition to the discussion board, you'll be selecting your own article to analyze. And so there's a list of articles that are all linked on Brightspace. You can choose whichever one you like. They're all different grade levels, different contexts, and they talk about translanguaging. And then the other assignment is to start working on your translanguaging pedagogy portfolio, specifically the first 5 purposes. So let me just get to this slide. So for the article, really the goal of this assignment is to have you engage with some translanguaging research. And so I've given you some different prompts to do that. So one piece of your paper will be just summarizing what was the focus, how does the article talk about translanguaging, what were the findings. But I also want you to think about how that article connects to other things that you've been reading and that we've been talking about in this class. And if you see anything similar or different from how they talk about translanguaging and how we have been or how other folks have been that you've engaged with. And also I want you to critically engage with it. So like what questions do you have as you're reading? Do you have any critiques of the article in terms of how they designed the study or how they approached translanguaging? Do you see any limitations? And if possible, apply the article to your own teaching context. So kind of what did you learn from it that you could apply to your teaching? Is there anything that you could maybe try or you would adapt for your context? So you'll be doing 2 of these. This is the first of 2 as a way to engage with some translanguaging research. The second piece is your translanguaging pedagogy portfolio. So this is something that you're starting now, but this will be your final project that you're working on in this course. It's a digital portfolio, so it's something that you could share with someone else. That's something that should apply to your own teaching context. I recommend a website. That's the easiest way to share, and I'm going to share some examples with you of what other students did last year. But if you find another platform you prefer, as long as it's something that could be shareable, that's fine. And so the way you'll structure it is that for each of those 10 purposes that Sarah Hessen and I created or identified, you're going to come up with 2 examples that would connect to your context or that you could use in your context. And across all of those, so there'll be 20 total, I want to see examples of some translanguaging in the content, meaning like maybe you'd be providing students with resources in different languages that they speak. Some translanguaging in the process. So process is like the process of learning. So content is like the materials, the actual physical content of what they're learning. Process might be a bilingual turn and talk, or kind of they're engaging in the learning process through translanguaging. And then product or assessment is like what they're creating, the final product. So maybe they create a bilingual report instead of a monolingual English report or a monolingual Portuguese report. So you don't need to do that for every single purpose, but I just want to see examples of kind of different ways of using translanguaging throughout. You should also include a definition of translanguaging somewhere. You can use your own, or you can cite ones from the readings, and I should see evidence that you're connecting to your course learning, and include a description of your context or whatever context it is that you're envisioning that this would be used for. So those are kind of the things to keep in mind as you're working. And again, this week you're going to start working on purposes 1 to 5, and then next week during class you'll be sharing some of the ideas that you came up with. I am going to share all these links with you. So I pulled together some links from last year just to show you what it can look like. There's no one way to do this. Many students last year used Google Sites. It seems to be a pretty good platform. I had a student who used Tumblr, someone who used Canva Sites, but I think Google Sites gives you the most flexibility. Again, totally up to you. Here's one, for example, from last year from a 9th grade English teacher. And so you can see she has her definition, her context, and then up here she went through each of the purposes. And so for each one, she created something or included visuals that connect to her context and explain the strategy. So this one's about how she kind of intentionally sets up the classroom space for translanguaging. This is an updated discussion protocol she created based on what she learned. And so you can kind of see as she goes through, what she's going to do differently for this chapter analysis for holistic assessment. She created this resource for translanguaging in the writing process. So I want to see how you're applying this to your specific context. All right, and so that is it for today. See, I did end us on time. So I'm going to stop share so I can see you all. But that was just kind of a quick overview of those 2 main things you'll be working on as you engage with the content for this week and your discussion posts like you did the last 2 weeks. So I will pause here for any questions for the whole group that someone wants to raise. Otherwise, we'll break and then I'll hang out in case there's a few more questions.
I just had a question as to where we find the purposes.
Sure. Yeah. So they should be, are they not linked in the content anywhere?
They are, I think, in this week's, I found them in this
Also-
week.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank
Also
you
in
for
the
that.
syllabus. You can find in the syllabus also.
Perfect. Thank you. Like, I don't
Thank
remember where I
you.
put them. Yes. So the end of the syllabus, I think, has them. And yes, they should be linked within this week's content. You also get to read this week this very short piece that I wrote with a couple of teachers showcasing some translanguaging strategies. But the 10 purposes are there. Yeah, great question.
If we are a pre-service teacher, can we just apply some of the purposes generally? Obviously I don't have an assignment I do already with a class, so could I just find something or create something more broad or general, or do you want us to find specific assignments to then do stuff with?
So it's up to you. Last year, I do have one example of a pre-service teacher I'll share, and I think she just kind of went general. I think it's helpful to like bound it in some way, just to give you kind of a, like she could say, this is for an elementary teacher, or this is for middle school math, because it just helps you think more concretely. But yes, I think if you don't have your own classroom, you can kind of figure out how you want to define that context.
So we could just say something like elementary reading, I would incorporate this, or elementary math, but it doesn't have to be like a specific like lesson, whatever unit thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's just showing, like, it's giving you a way to like concretely apply some of these ideas. So like if I'm thinking about holistic assessment, what might that actually look like in practice?
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Other questions? Okay, we will wrap up. It was great to see you all. I look forward to seeing you next week. It will be late for me as well again, but I love seeing your faces, so worth it. But have a wonderful week. I will hang out for a few more minutes for anyone else who has a question that didn't ask it yet. Otherwise, I will see you online.
Thank you.
Thank you.